Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
This is the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 149, where we're talking all about Angular 5. I'm your host this week, Danny Blue, and with me is Amal Hussein.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, so, like I said, we're going to be talking all about Angular. We have some very special guests with us this week, but before we do that, I'm going to kick it over to Leon, who's going to tell us all about This Week in Web.
Thank you very much, Danny. So, first of all, the State of JavaScript 2017 survey results are out, which provides great insight into how 28,000 developers are using JavaScript. This survey looks at what frameworks are most used and the satisfaction associated with them, plus so much more. There's some really fantastic statistics in here. You should really go and check that out. Next, I've got an interesting new project called Nectar.js, which has now got an alpha release available. Nectar.js compiles JavaScript to native platforms such as Windows, Linux, Arduino, and WebAssembly. Very interesting concept, so go and check out that project. Beginning with today's preview release, the Windows Insider Preview 17063, Service Worker, Push, and Cache are enabled by default in Microsoft Edge, which is fabulous news. And the last thing I've got for you today is that there's a new release of the V8 JavaScript engine. That's version 6.4. It includes better performance, reduced memory consumption, and some new ECMAScript features. And that's everything for me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks very much, Leon. A lot of really cool stuff going on. So, like I said before, we have two very special guests with us this week. We have Michael Prentice. Say hi, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
And Stephen Fluin.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you guys both very much for coming on today. So, starting with Michael, why don't you give us, for those of us that aren't familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background.
Okay, I am an Angular GE. I work with my own consulting company, DevIntent, and I work with a lot of different small, medium, and large customers to mostly build them different sorts of Angular applications, from Angular JS material to the latest Angular material, and do a lot of other things with schematics and things like that. So good to be here.
Thanks very much. And Stephen, what about you? What types of things are you into?
Sure. So my role here is I'm a developer advocate, actually on the Angular team at Google. So in terms of background, I come from kind of a varied background of entrepreneurship, software consulting. So helping small, mid-sized, and large companies make technology choices around sort of platforms and strategy and architecture and those sorts of things. And now on the Angular team here, I'm really responsible for a number of different things. So looking at really kind of a couple things. First is helping organizations and developers be successful with Angular. And then second is understanding what it's like to be an Angular developer out in the real world, so we can reflect those needs onto the team and make sure that we're making the right sort of product decisions as we continue to evolve the platform.
That is so cool. What a cool job you both have, by the way. And thank you so much for both coming on the show. So just so our listeners have some context here, Danny is the other host for today, and he is a serious Angular nerd. I was a serious Angular nerd many years ago. Unfortunately, my company a long time ago decided to, not continue on with Angular after the version 2, and so it's been a long time since I've had a chance to dive into Angular, so I'm really excited. And so I guess I think a lot of our listeners may be familiar with Angular just because it was one of the large frameworks to do this right a long time ago, and it still is obviously very popular. For those of us who might not be as familiar with the newer versions of Angular, would you be able to just briefly kind of describe the journey between Angular 1X, which is a very different framework, and Angular 5 and beyond?
Sure. So I'll kind of break it down a couple ways. So first, I'll start with the terminology. So when I say AngularJS, I'm referring to versions kind of 1X and before. And when I use the term Angular, I'm referring to kind of all of the future generations, so 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, however many future versions. We're really trying to get away from the number because we're at a stage now where once you've made the migration over to Angular from AngularJS, the version updates shouldn't really kind of affect you in the same way that the AngularJS to Angular transition did. We kind of want to take on the Chrome philosophy of where most people don't really worry about the version of Chrome they're running. Often there's cool new features in newer versions, but the number ends up not mattering. So I'll kind of tell a little bit of a story about kind of how we got where we were or where we are today. So AngularJS was a framework started by the same team here at Google, really trying to figure out, okay, what should web development look like, right? If we take what's possible on the platform today and take what we want applications to look like and how we want development to feel, that was really the kind of core idea. And so AngularJS was this really great JavaScript-based single-page application framework, which ended up becoming kind of more and more popular over time. So over the kind of years since it launched in 2009, we really picked up hundreds of thousands and then millions of developers using AngularJS, and then actually hundreds of thousands of production applications. And one of the interesting things about kind of both AngularJS and Angular is that about 90% of the applications that are built with it are actually behind the firewall. So not targeting necessarily websites on kind of the public internet, so to say, but a lot of them are being used by big companies, enterprises, for things like internal behind the firewall productivity things like, hey, I need a system where my people can log time or submit expenses, those sorts of things. So there's kind of hundreds of thousands and possibly even millions of those applications out there in the wild. And AngularJS saw so much success and saw so many of these different applications being built. What ended up happening was that the kind of cracks started showing. So when you build an application with maybe hundreds of thousands of points of data, with the digest cycle that we had and the scope cycle with controllers and scopes and all these sorts of things, you ended up being able to kind of shoot yourself in the foot. And so you were able to build applications that were a little bit harder to maintain, weren't performant, kind of ran into some kind of core challenges. And so the team saw kind of the ways that developers were kind of getting in their own ways in terms of maintainability and extensibility. And the team also saw that the web as a platform was continuing to evolve, right? We had ES 2015, we had kind of the new module syntax, we had cool new technologies like TypeScript and typing for the web. And so these two things drove them to realize that they needed to use the same philosophies and kind of the same ideas that they had around building AngularJS, but they needed a rewrite. And so in around 2000, I think it was 14, the team started working on Angular, or what they called at the time, Angular 2. And so it took about 2 years from kind of the first commit until the public production launch back in September of 2016. But what ended up happening, or what ended up resulting, was this fantastic kind of platform that we call Angular. And so Angular is actually a much simpler platform than AngularJS was in terms of the kind of framework side of things, in terms of the number of directives, the number of concepts that you have to learn that are Angular specific. But what we did is that we're kind of much more reliant on the modern web. So one of the things I like to say is that an Angular application day one looks a lot like your AngularJS application used to look after a month or two of development, after you've added. So I mean, you start an AngularJS application by throwing a script tag in the top of the page. Then you want to refactor that into a bunch of different files. Then you want to build system. You want to be concatenating your files. You want to be minifying. Then you throw Webpack in and things like that. And so we kind of include all of that day one as part of being an Angular developer, so that we're really helping you to build things. The other kind of major thing is I keep using the term platform. And the big transition there is AngularJS was really just the kind of framework. So how do we take state and how do we render that out to the browser? We're really trying to focus more on the end-to-end developer experience. Everything from how do you get started, scaffolding out new projects, understanding best practices. How do I then kind of scale things out? How do I take advantage of server-side rendering, cool new technologies like that? And so we have a bunch of things like Angular Material. We have a CLI. And we're really focused on making developers more productive kind of at every stage of a project.
Thank you. I think that's a really good overview of just kind of roughly how we got how we got to this point. And fundamentally, like I agree to your last point. I agree about how because I know early on and still now some people still say like, oh, it's too hard to get started with Angular, but really you just kind of get started where you're going to end up. Fundamentally, you're probably not just going to end up putting a script tag at the top of your page. So not much there.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a great answer, Stephen. So with that in mind, so you're saying Angular is a platform, right? And so as somebody who's been watching Angular from the periphery, like I know that Angular's also made some really cool leaps and bounds, and with types and it seemed like Angular came with a lot out of the box, right? Whether it was observable support, TypeScript, and to be honest with you, there's also a lot of change, right? And I'll ask a tough question here. I mean, it's a much higher learning curve to some degree, and so I guess what's the value prop with Angular if it's supposed to be lightweight and yet it's also a platform? I mean, is it contradictory? And then also, was it too much to ask users to learn TypeScript and learn about streams and learn and learn a new framework and library?
Sure. So, I mean, what I'll say is 90% of the learning that you have to go through in terms of getting up to speed with Angular isn't even Angular. It's the modern web that we are kind of building on top of. And so if we look specifically at a couple things you mentioned, so I think TypeScript is a really great technology because all JavaScript, all kind of ES 2016, ES 2017 is also valid TypeScript. And so from that perspective, we're using it as kind of a build system. You don't actually have to opt in beyond kind of two places, which is our decorator syntax. So this is just how we say, here's some metadata for a component or for a module, and then for our dependency injection. And these from a tangible standpoint, directly solve a couple of the problems we saw with AngularJS, where I know a lot of developers would do things like $scope dot whatever, or you'd use dependency injection and you'd have like little typos where maybe the name of my service didn't match the string that was in another file. And there was nothing the tooling could do to help you with those things. And so we've kind of, by adopting and kind of leaning so heavily on things like TypeScript, we've kind of eliminated that entire category of errors. And when it comes to things like observables, I think, I mean, for me as a developer even, my first interaction and encounter with promises was via AngularJS. And so, and then my first interaction with observables and this idea of kind of reactive programming and stream processing came with Angular. And so I've actually heard from a number of developers, which is actually a surprise to me, which is that they feel like getting up to speed on Angular has made them a better developer kind of in a way that has nothing to do with Angular.
I'll actually add on a little bit just from some of my experience, both working with Angular since since beta and also teaching it to other people now. I will say as well as that most of the things that I find people have issues with Angular aren't Angular. A lot of it is observables, wrapping your head around observables. And if you don't have any experience with any sort of static typing, it can cause a little bit of headache while you try to wrap your head around something that you just don't have a lot of experience with.
Like TypeScript, I'm personally a big fan of it. I mean, and I've talked to a lot of companies that use TypeScript, and I've never met a company that tried TypeScript for a week and didn't end up liking it. I mean, because all of the types are optional, because it's really kind of opt into however far you want to use these sorts of tools. I've even taken kind of pure JavaScript files I wrote, just renamed them .ts, and then the compilers found logical errors. Like I was console logging ERROR when my variable name was named ERR, right? And I didn't have to do anything, and the compiler just kind of found that problem in my JavaScript.
And of course, with the newer versions of TypeScript as well, you can actually type check JavaScript files, which is also fantastic. So I've actually done that at work as well with some of our build setup, right? With some of our custom build tools, actually not converting them to TypeScript, but just using the type checker from TypeScript over our JavaScript files.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the other benefits that we see is that you can really use the best of the web when it comes to kind of new language features. So because TypeScript supports all of the kind of newer features, modules, classes, ES 2015, ES 2016, ES 2017, you can just write great JavaScript and it will just work in older browsers, right? Because it includes that transpilation, that down leveling.
I've got one more point on this is with AngularJS, a lot of developers, especially back-end developers, were just getting into front-end development, and they could see that AngularJS gave their application the structure that was similar to what they're used to on the back end. And so a lot of new developers really got started with AngularJS like that. And for a lot of them, they didn't have to learn like JavaScript that much. They could just kind of stay within the AngularJS world, add in, their business logic, and kind of their app would work. I think now with Angular embracing the platform more and being more integrated with JavaScript and having, more JavaScript be able to just be used with Angular, I think there's more opportunities, especially with operators where, you do need to learn some different techniques. You may use ES6 or ES 2015 features that you're not familiar with. And so a lot of developers, I think, are having to kind of get up to speed also with just a lot of JavaScript fundamentals, a lot of the new JavaScript, and that can, definitely take some time. So one of the things that I do when I work with different customers is really encourage them to provide training on a lot of the fundamentals of just, JavaScript and TypeScript and RxJS, and really try to learn some of that before you sort of throw your developers and say, build production apps right now. And like we've mentioned, it's really all part of, getting up to speed with the modern web. And, that's going to apply to many other frameworks and technologies as well. So it's really good to get up to speed.
Yeah. One of the things that I get to do is I get to work with a lot of our educator partners, so companies that train people on Angular. And one of the interesting things that I've seen is that about half of the people learning Angular are coming from AngularJS. So kind of just taking all the philosophies, the dependency injection, declarative templates, all those sorts of things, and just applying them in Angular in the same way. But the other half are coming from more traditional backend technologies like Java and .NET, where Angular really provides kind of an application mentality that is very familiar and kind of makes a lot of sense. And then they're able to take advantage of the benefits of kind of moving to the client side, moving to the front end in terms of really great user experiences.
Yeah. So I agree with every point you guys made. I can tell you my own personal experience with moving into React. Angular 1X, there was a lot of magic, right? And until you had to really dig in and or make an application at a huge scale, you maybe never really understood things like the digest cycle and how things worked, right? There was a lot of magic that you didn't have to understand, and that's one of the reasons I think it became so popular. Is that it made everybody really productive really quickly, but on that same token with React, I felt like there was just a lot of just functional JavaScript, and I was able to hone down on, mastering, certain types of, JavaScript interactions that I really didn't get a chance to master very much with Angular 1X. And so I'm really glad to hear that, it seems like people are having the same experiences with Angular. So I keep saying Angular and in two different contexts. I mean AngularJS, not Angular. So, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, so one of the reasons we asked you guys to come on is not only just to talk about Angular itself, but not too long ago, Angular had another major release bump. To Angular 5, and I think we're now on 5.1.1 is the version as at this point. So a couple of things. One, can someone talk a little bit about the concept of Semver and why Angular is doing it, and then let's dig into let's unpack a little bit of what is in Angular 5, why it's a major release, and just some of the cool stuff that's in it and some of the cool stuff to look forward to in the future.
Sure. So one of the things that we did as part of shipping kind of the first production version of Angular, was we announced that we're adopting SemVer, or semantic versioning. And really this was driven by a couple of things. In AngularJS, you didn't really know what was coming with every release, right? Like, should I adopt it? Should I not adopt it? And so you didn't necessarily have a ton of visibility or predictability. Every release was kind of unique. So what we did is we adopted semantic versioning, which basically says that the number of your release says something about the content. And so you've got kind of the three decimals there. So if we think 500 or let's say 510. So in 5105 is the major release. So the idea is that we can only do any sort of breaking changes. So anything that will make your code stop working, that should only happen in a major release. And then we can only add features as part of a minor release, so that's second digit. And then patches are only bug fixes. And so by doing this, we've really done a good job of making sure that any developer, once you're on a major release, you should just be able to kind of freely update your patches and minors without having to kind of rewrite a single line of code. We also kind of combined that with this idea of we want to be super transparent and predictable. And so we have been working towards these idea of kind of twice a year or around every 6 month major releases. And so that means we have the opportunity to put breaking changes out every 6 months. So this can sound a little scary at first, especially if you're used to kind of the AngularJS days where we broke your code all the time in some cases. But we've actually done a ton of effort focused on the stability of the platform and making sure that updates are very easy. So we've had 2 major updates already since September 2016. So you went from 2 to 4 and then 4 to 5. And both of these, I would say, were very, very simple. So for small applications, I'll say less than an hour. For large applications, less than a day or less than a week. And so this is something we really want to continue with, this idea that most of your code is going to stay the same across kind of major versions. But then we're going to, as possible, kind of make dramatic improvements behind the scenes. So one of the things that we did between versions 2 and versions 4 was we rewrote the view engine. And that ended up making applications something like 40% smaller, which meant that there's a big performance boost for developers just by adopting a new major release.
That is so cool. I'm wondering, has your team taking advantage of AST like code modifications to auto to let developers kind of script the upgrades if and when possible?
Yes. So this is something that we've done somewhat kind of experimentally. So one of the things that we had to do for Angular Material in particular was we had to rename the entire namespace. So we went from MD to MAT, so Material Design to MAT. And we had to do this because of we wanted to help developers have compatibility if they were running both AngularJS and Angular on the same page. And so this actually sounds like a big change, right? Because it affects CSS selectors. So you have to adjust CSS, you have to adjust HTML, you have to adjust references to components and things like that. But we built a tool that used the ASTs, the underlying kind of structure of your code, to do all of these updates intelligently. And so as part of that update, we released a tool that did this for you. And I only heard success stories about that tool. And so I would call that a kind of a resounding success of, hey, we need to evolve the platform. We need to kind of make changes to make things better for developers. But let's, as much as possible, automate these things. And that's something we're continuing to invest in and think about. So at conferences, I always talk about this idea of an ng update command that will automatically put you on the latest version, whether that's a patch, minor, or even possibly even a major, and then make most of the changes or make some of the changes for you, and then kind of walk you through the rest of the changes.
That just sounds like a dream. That just sounds like something that doesn't exist.
It sounds like it doesn't exist, but I mean, we've shown it's possible now with the material design update. And I mean, we have this really nice tool called schematics, which was released as part of our CLI dev kit. And so what schematics does is it basically takes your file system, it takes a tree of files, does any sort of kind of arbitrary code processing to them using the ASTs, using the package managers, et cetera, and then returns an updated tree. And so we use this for if you use our CLI to create a new project. We use this if you want to add a component to an existing project where we have to go create the component file, apply variable replacement, those sorts of things. But also we need to update references to that component or create references to that component. And so schematics does that in a very safe, very clean way. And we're just seeing kind of developers just getting started to take advantage of schematics. There's a few people in the Drupal community that are building things like, for example, schematics that query a backend, look at the shape of an API, and then automatically create services locally for those backends, for those APIs.
Oh, that's so cool because if you have the abstract, the AST, if you have the abstract syntax tree, like you actually can, what arguments it's expecting, so you can pretty much build the reverse of that, right? That's so cool. Anyway, so I'm actually personally using ASTs in a project right now. I'm heavily, in that world and doing a bunch of updates and changes, and so I'm really glad to hear that you guys have an open source project that does that as well. I'll have to check it out. And for our listeners, ASTs are abstract syntax trees. It's kind of the underlying shape of your code, as Stephen so nicely said. And ASTExplorer.net is an awesome site to play around with snippets of JavaScript and examine the ASTs. So we'll definitely link that in the show notes.
And it's actually also one of the interesting challenges that we have as the Angular team is we obviously work at Google. And so there's a number of different projects. I think there's something like over 400 projects or something at this point within Google that are using Angular. And the policy at Google is because we have a single source code kind of code base, we have a mono repository. If someone else if we break someone and they have unit tests and so a change that we make to Angular breaks them, we actually have to go fix them. So it's both a kind of a lesson in terms of defensive programming if you're an application developer, but then also it kind of deeply ingrains the understanding to what does it take to maintain and keep fresh a very, very kind of large code base. And so the only way that we're able to do that and the only way we're able to scale that is both to kind of really understand the implications of some of the kind of breaking changes that we make, but then also using these sorts of AST based kind of tools to intelligently update code.
And can all open source projects adopt that policy like that? I agree. That would never no one would ever get any work done, but that'd be amazing.
So it's kind of funny. I would love to do that with the open source world more. We actually had an effort that we're still trying to scale out a little bit, what I call community CI, where basically if other people have continuous integration systems with kind of a known working project, we on a kind of a opt-in handpicked basis, we want to find those quality systems and have them actually send us error reports with every commit to master. So if you're building an Angular application and you're interested in this, you can kind of shoot an email to devrel@angular.io and let us know, and we'll see if we can kind of get you hooked into that. Because I would love to know not only if we're breaking Google, but I'd love to know if we're breaking other people out in the world.
Awesome. So we've got a little bit of background. We've talked about what Angular is. We talked about kind of how we've gotten to the certain point that we're at. Let's unwrap what is in Angular 5 now as far as features, just other cool stuff. And so of course, not just talking about, so this would include things like Angular CLI, because as you guys said, Angular is more of a platform. There are a lot of parts to it. So I guess let's just start out with starting with Stephen. What is your favorite new feature that's in Angular 5?
What's my favorite feature? I'm really a big fan of kind of the smaller little things. So as a version 5, we've done a bunch more to optimize builds for you. And so developers will basically see tens or hundreds of KB drop off their application without really changing anything. So whenever we can do that behind the scenes, we basically keep the platform as stable as possible and then make things better for you automatically. That's where I think there's kind of this magic from the team of like, wow, you just made my application better.
And there are a couple ways that was achieved in Angular 5, right? So some of that was at build time with a new tool called Build Optimizer, and then there's also the case where just fewer polyfills are required for more modern browsers. Could you speak to both of those parts? Both the one, how did Angular get rid of some polyfills? What polyfills did they get rid of? And what Build Optimizer is and what it does?
Sure. So Build Optimizer is basically a step that's being run as part of our CLI, and what it does is it uses our knowledge of your applications to improve the tree shaking that's coming from underlying tools like Webpack and like Uglify. There's a few examples of this where, because we know that your Angular components don't have side effects in general, we can mark them as pure. And so because we understand your application, because we understand the tooling, that we've got this whole kind of build tool chain that we've set up for you, we can say, hey, these things are pure, these things don't have side effects, and then, which then improves the things that the tools were already trying to do, but they can do them a little bit better. We also do things like removing decorators, because decorators, that kind of metadata layer, you don't need that at runtime. That's just used to convert your HTML templates into the JavaScript that's going to be used to kind of run them to run the change detection. The other piece that you mentioned, I think, was around removing polyfills. And one of the bigger ones there was that previously we needed both kind of the reflect polyfill. So we just built a static version of that, so we don't need reflect anymore. And then the other one was for internationalization. So one of the things we tried to do in Angular as of the first release was the 2.0 release in September, was we were trying to rely on the browsers to do internationalization. So we said, hey, if you want to take a string and then turn it into a localized number, let's use the browser APIs that exist, which is, I think, was a really good idea. In general, I wish the browsers would take care of this for you, and then we'd have kind of really small, really high-performing applications, because we'd just be relying on browsers and the locales that the user has installed. But it actually ended up not working, because all the browsers had slightly different implementations, and so then we needed these polyfills to make sure that all the implementations were the same. And then also the features didn't necessarily match developer expectations for what things like a currency pipe would do or a date pipe would do in terms of what they would get out of the box. And so we went back to the same strategy that we used in AngularJS, which was build our own, which is smaller and then can be shared across browsers without having to worry about that compatibility.
That's awesome. Smaller is always better in terms of the web.
Yeah, and especially mobile web. So Alex Russell, who's another Googler, who's like, he's on the tag for W3C. He's really been a big push behind making web components a thing. Progressive web apps, I think he kind of helped coin that term. And so he said that Angular is now in the running for mobile development. And I know at Adios Mani, at I/O last year, kind of brushed up on this lightly. Angular could be doing better on mobile web, and it seems like we might be there now with this major release. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to look at it. So you want to be small for simple applications, and then grow only as needed to as you're building out kind of bigger and bigger applications. So as of version 5 now, we kind of meet the definition for fast. And I will say that definition that Alex uses is really focused on kind of emerging markets, things like 2G connections, 3G connections on lower end devices, where even things like parse time for the JavaScript can end up adding seconds to your application. So we've spent a ton of time on continuing to make Angular better behind the scenes. And so we really do care about kind of all these things, the size, the mobile use cases, the experience. And so this is something that we've been very successful with over the last couple of releases, and we're going to continue to invest, and you're going to continue to see improvements in that in the future. When we talk about kind of Angular as a platform, one of the things we talk about is what do we value? And so we talk about kind of three things. We say that we value applications that users love to use, which for a user to love to use it, it has to be performant. It's got to be load fast. It's got to be kind of rich and engaging and have things like progressive web apps and server-side rendering and crawlable and things like that. And then apps that developers love to build. So really focusing on the developer experience of how easy is it started, how easy is it to be maintainable, how clear is my intent at kind of each part of my code. And then the last piece, which is really important to us, is a community where everyone feels welcome, because Angular is only successful because we have a huge community of people building libraries, building tools, building kind of this awesome ecosystem of support that really helps all of the Angular developers out there.
Yeah, I have to say the Angular community is still my favorite web community by far. Woo-hoo. Also, absolutely. And most welcoming and most fun and just, most organized, it seems, to some degree. But also the best documentation. And I have to say that Google has this like awesome, and I'm not sure actually, maybe you can correct me if this is like a company-wide thing, but it seems like the people writing the code should never be responsible for writing the doc. So they're two different people, and or two different groups of people. And so what you have is you don't have maintainers writing documentation, and that kind of really creates rich documentation, which is like which also has all the right context, right? And I remember with 1X, I love how you look at an API and then there was a tab for like looking at the test, right? Like here's how to unit test it, here's how to test it end to end. Like it was just sick. Like I love that. It made it so easy to be productive. I just want to say like thank you so much. Like so
awesome. Glad to hear that you like
everything
that.
Is still as awesome as that, right?
It's something it's impossible to be perfect at, so we're always trying to get better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a mix of Googlers as well as community contributors for documentation, and also actual technical writers that are professional writers of documentation that are helping.
Yeah, no,
And one of the things we did in the last 6 months was we actually integrated our website into the main Angular repo. So on GitHub in the Angular org, the Angular project both includes all of the kind of platform things like HTTP client, platform browser, all those sorts of things, but it also now includes the Angular.io website and all of its content. So hopefully we've made it easy for other people to contribute or to kind of check it out and build the site themselves, see what's going on. It's an Angular app itself. Because we do want that kind of level of approachability where anyone can kind of get in and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Here's some ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, so getting back to thank you for that. And so getting back to the newer features, right? So we have this awesome CLI, and Angular is now component. It's component / directive based. It's kind of very similar to I think React and Vue in that sense. Can you kind of elaborate some more on what are the value propositions, right? So out of all of the component light component libraries, what else am I getting with an Angular component, right? And I guess and especially in the context of version 5.
Sure. Well, I don't think anything is kind of really new there in version 5. So I'll just touch on it briefly, and then you can tell me if you want to hear more. Angular, kind of people choose Angular for a number of different reasons. So obviously we're very opinionated. So we're trying to give you this whole kind of platform. So we're trying to give you everything from a router to HTTP to the full stack that you need to be productive. People like that we are trustworthy. I mean, we have a established track record now for over a year of kind of these scheduled planned releases that were relatively easy updates across kind of even these major releases with some small breaking changes. People really like the ecosystem that we've got. People really like that Angular is familiar, whether you're coming from a .NET, a Java, or AngularJS. And then really just the scale. So one of the nice things about Angular is that not just kind of is it being used to build large applications, but it's also being used by kind of large teams. So there's some very natural breakpoints where you can have things like designers working on these declarative templates who don't need to know JavaScript. You can have kind of architects working at the module level, thinking about how do we lazy load the right parts of our code at the right time, and developers kind of focusing more at the component level of, okay, what should this UX be? How should we be loading and managing the data?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Stephen, you got a chance to give us your highlights about Angular 5 and some of the new stuff there. So, Michael, why don't you give us your favorite? Tell us your favorite thing about about Angular 5. What's something new? What's something improved?
Okay. Yeah, mine are a little bit more outside of the core of Angular. One is schematics, and that's part of the Angular dev kit, which is a building block of the CLI. So schematics are really exciting because they allow you to sort of, at an enterprise level, customize how you want to generate out new components, new services, even new applications. And so you're able to use all the cool stuff that's in the CLI, but then when you generate that, you don't have to go in and fix each of them after you generate them to be like what your company does or to fit your coding conventions. You can actually have all your schematics. You can have a separate sort of repo where you keep track of all that, and then you can deploy that across many different teams in your organization. And then the other one is Material and the new CDK. So it came out about a month after 5.0, but the Angular Material 5.0 and CDK are available and stable now. They've released from beta. And so that came out with a bunch of stable components. The new data table looks amazing. I just watched the Angular Connect video for that. Great stuff there as far as performance and extensibility. So there's all these new components, all these components that are now officially stable and are ready to be used in production applications at any company or any sort of level there. And then the CDK is another one of these building blocks that is a building block of Material, and it gives you a bunch of different features for building your own sort of pop-ups and overlays and handling accessibility and things like that. So just recently, the documentation became available for that. That's available on the material.angular.io site /CDK. And there's also now about 3 to 5 really good videos on the CDK. Until then, it's kind of been something that's been happening, but not a lot of public information available. So now if you're interested in building a component framework or a component set, definitely check out the CDK. And now you have documentation, which will be improving over time. And then lots of videos to sort of explain to you the different modules of the CDK.
I think the CDK is a really good, a really interesting concept that, at least in, I don't have millions of years of experience at this, but at least it is not something that I've seen in exactly this way. There have always been a ton of component frameworks. There's been Bootstrap and various versions of Material and stuff like that. But I think this is it's really interesting to see kind of a visually unopinionated way of building components and saving the end user's time, because I also imagine they probably handle things and you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but so for example, the Angular Forms modules, if you want to have a custom input, you have to make sure that it's that is available and defined for forms. So does the CDK do anything to help you out with anything like that?
With forms, I'm not too sure. Definitely things with pop-ups and panels. There's also scrolling. There's portals, which allow you to sort of project an element or a component or a template into a certain part of the page. So there's lots of helpers there, and it's really sort of lessons learned over AngularJS material and Angular material. And then that was, sort of extracted out of Angular material to share with the wider community. And I think that's sort of the thing that a number of these previous component UI frameworks have sort of, they built these, and a lot of them have sort of duplicated the effort and built the same thing for all these different frameworks. But none of them really took the time, and obviously it costs money. It takes, effort to, open source, or, you're sort of open sourcing from your open source, it's pulling this reusable piece out and making it available to everybody. Not everyone has, not anyone has really had time for that. So it's really great that the material team has been able to do that, and now everyone can benefit.
And maybe I can jump in with an example of the CDK for everyone who's listening. So a great example of a CDK feature capability is overlays. And so overlays are something from a UX standpoint that we often want. We want these kind of beautiful pop-ups, beautiful dialogues, detail views that kind of come up when you click on something. But from an architectural standpoint, they're actually very challenging because I want to define my overlay as close as possible to the thing that's kind of invoking it, right? Or within the context of the specific page that I'm in, the specific part of my application. But if you do that from an HTML standpoint, right, where I put the HTML for that overlay in the DOM at the place where it kind of makes sense architecturally, then I run into all sorts of problems with CSS and with kind of the rendering of that HTML, because if anything at a parent level, I have positioned absolute or overflow hidden, my overlay won't actually show up properly. And so this is a problem that kind of everyone has to solve to build an overlay. And so we had to solve this as part of building Angular material, but we've packaged up the solution to that in a way that's kind of reusable by other developers or other component libraries, so that if you need to render an overlay and you want to define it as close as possible in context, but you want to overcome kind of these browser limitations of where and how it renders, you just use the CDK's overlay capability, and that solves that for you.
No, I like I said, I like it all. It's just the common problems that everybody has to solve when you're doing things like that, but just solved in a way that is generic enough that you can do all of your own design stuff around it, which is great. So one of the things that I was really excited about with Angular 5 was were faster AOT builds. So for anybody that's not familiar, AOT means ahead of time. So Angular ships with the ability to compile in two different ways. One is ahead of time, so at build time. And then one is dynamically in the browser, where you actually ship the compiler code to the browser. So that's the way that a lot of dev was done. So dev work would be done that way because it was faster to go. And then for production builds, you would use the AOT compiler, so you didn't have to ship the compiler code to the browser, which led to smaller bundles, faster startup times, all that kind of stuff. So one of the cool things with this was making AOT fast enough to use for development. Now I'm sure there's still like if your project is still a certain size, there would still be some problems, but I know for right now we're using AOT by default for all of our build stuff. So can we talk a little bit about the AOT compiler, the improvements that it's been made to it? I know it's using TypeScript transforms now. So like, how is that different from the way it was handled before? Stuff like that.
Sure. I'll just touch briefly on that. So as you said, we rebuilt as part of the 5.0 release how we do our compilation. So previously we were basically just running our own script. So we were doing our own parsing, AST parsing of your metadata, all the decorators, things like that. And then generating out this kind of JavaScript that says like document.createElement and all that stuff. What we did was instead of running that as a separate process that then that generates TypeScript and then gets compiled by the TypeScript compiler, now we're actually integrated into the TypeScript compilation process. And so because both of these things happen at once, it's dramatically faster. It opens up things like being able to watch a compilation process and do incremental rebuilds of both your Angular code and the TypeScript code coming from that. So it's a much cleaner way. And so it was actually nice. So we were able to work with Microsoft and the TypeScript team to get the transforms to a place that we needed them, and then take advantage of that capability.
Awesome. And so like I said, there still seem to be some people that have problems with if your project grows above a certain size, it's still AOT is still not reasonable because it still does take, like each rebuild still does take a little bit longer. So I'm assuming there's still ongoing work to make AOT even better so that it can be the default for everybody.
Correct. Yep. Exactly.
Awesome. And also, just so anybody knows, all these things are available to you in the CLI out of the box. So if you if you want to run ng serve, if you just do --AOT, you will serve it with AOT, and AOT is used by default for all production builds, which is great because more errors at build time means less errors at runtime.
That's the idea.
Super cool, by the way. You guys need to figure out how to get that into the non-Angular world if it's not already there. That's very cool. I think so many people.
Yeah, I mean, like this idea of when you should do your compilation is kind of interesting, right? So we do most of our compilation at build time, whereas like AngularJS, everything happened at runtime. And so it opens up a number of different kind of opportunities, but also creates a bunch of challenges in terms of what you can do at build time and what you can do at runtime. So I think the state of the art is going to continue to get better over the next couple of years.
So cool. So I think we have time for maybe one more feature before we need to wrap up. I mean, do you guys want to tell us a little, or I guess if we have a feature, we can talk about it. Otherwise, we can maybe talk about Angular Labs if we have time.
Sure. So I'll just kind of give a brief overview of Angular Labs and then talk about kind of one of the kind of relevant challenges to some of the things we've talked about. So Angular Labs is kind of a new moniker that we're using for efforts that are of kind of a tentative or unsure from a destination standpoint. So we don't know what they'll end up like. We think we have an idea, but the ultimate implementation might end up changing kind of dramatically between where we are now and when we say, hey, it's graduated from Angular Labs. And so an example of a labs project is this project that we've got called ABC, or Angular plus Bazel plus Closure. And so Bazel is a build system that was built within Google and then open sourced, and Closure is a JavaScript compiler that, again, built within Google and open sourced. And the interesting thing about Bazel is that it gives you the ability to think of JavaScript with kind of this idea of individual build units. So we could build a single module at a time, or theoretically, we could build a single template at a time. And the benefit there is that if you have an application with several hundred or 1,000 developers and thousands of components, we'd like to not be able to, or not even have to touch any of the pieces of the application that you haven't touched, right? So you want the build time to grow or to be based on only the amount of code that you've changed at a given time. And this is impossible with kind of the state-of-the-art tooling that we've got with like Webpack, where it needs to know everything about the entire application at one time. There's not kind of these individual compilation units. And so Bazel is kind of a very interesting thing that if we can make it easy enough and integrate it well enough into the tools, it solves a lot of those, hey, I have 10,000 files, please build everything very quickly. There's a couple other Angular Labs projects that are exciting too. One is called Angular Elements. And so this is an effort that we've been working on to take kind of your Angular components or your Angular application, and instead of shipping it for running kind of directly in the browser via UMD, the idea would be to create a self-bootstrapping web component. So if you're building an Angular application and you want to take a widget or a component or some subset of your application and ship it so that other people can embed it as a widget on their sites, we can kind of produce a web component that will kind of take care of that for the other developer, which should kind of solve a number of different problems. So one, that they don't have to know Angular because it's just a web component. They can just kind of put it on their page. But it also improves compatibility. Like maybe you're at a company or a team that you have to use multiple technologies. So you have to use some other framework. This would enable to use an Angular component within that kind of other framework.
Wow, that's really cool. So is this like rendering edge side, via CDN, and then maybe using like Shadow DOM or something for scope? Like I'm curious how this works. This is fascinating.
No. So instead of building to JavaScript that kind of manually bootstraps, you just render to a JavaScript file that would be self-bootstrapping via web component spec. So I would give you a JavaScript file, and then you would include that JavaScript file on your page. And then as soon as you use like a my-component tag, that is registered as a web component, so it'll self-bootstrap and then load and run and have all the kind of Angular features that you're looking for, like dependency injection services, all those sorts of things, but then work on someone else's page.
And this has been super, super embraced by the community. I've seen a ton of blog posts. There's a bunch of different repos out there with example components built with this. And at the moment, it's just a branch in the Angular project. So it's, a very early labs project, but people are already trying to build all kinds of things with it and show really interesting examples.
Because also theoretically, if you're just using custom elements as the component layer, you could theoretically ship much less of Angular, depending on exactly what you're using. Correct?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily a great fit, and this is something we're still thinking about and exploring for the entire component model. Just because web components kind of have a lot of inherent side effects, which can make it harder to test. It can make it harder to mock things out. But it's something that we're exploring.
Yeah, I think that the testing story with web components is a very interesting one. I'm really excited to dig into that a little bit more. I'm a open web engineer at Boku now, and we're doing a lot with Test 262 and web platform tests. So I hope to, be better at this in 6 months and have lots of answers for all of you on these problems. But really quickly, actually, so Custom Elements Everywhere, which is this awesome site that Rob Dodson, another Googler, put together to help JavaScript frameworks, UI frameworks, work well with having support for custom elements. How is Angular 5 doing on that spec? I'm assuming like stellar.
Angular is doing awesome with web components. I actually code presented with Rob Dodson on using web components in Angular. Because we treat the DOM in kind of a very clean way, basically you can bind to a web component just as easily as you can bind to any DOM element. So it's actually a very nice cohesive story. And then we actually, Angular can solve a bunch of problems that come up with using web components. So one of the challenges, for example, is if you're building a form and you want to include some custom controls via web components, you kind of manually have to write a bunch of code to get the values out of those web components and then attach them into the form before you submit. But because, for example, via Angular Forms, we're already doing that wiring for you, we can automatically tap into web components in the same way and get that state in a very cohesive way with less code.
Oh, that's super cool. So I know we want to get into service worker support with Michael just quickly before we end, but can you briefly tell us about Future as well? I know Future is another project from Angular Labs.
No, sorry, that's just my mistake. That just means like not the name. That's just the future.
Gosh. I'm like looking at my notes. I'm like, what, future? Okay.
Future.
It's like, what is future?
The future?
All right. The future is service worker. I love service workers. Service workers make you feel like God in the browser. Michael, tell us about service worker support.
Okay. So service worker support came in Angular 5, but it took a little bit to get the CLI support for that, which of course everyone wants it to just sort of work out of the box. But
we try not to ship features without CLI support anymore. We don't consider them shipped until they just work.
So that is available now in the Angular CLI 1.6. You can kind of generate an app or even add a service worker to your app with the CLI. Additionally, in the 1.6 has come improvements, of course, for schematics and things like that. But now using schematics, you're able to actually generate out. So we have commands for generating a universal module for your app to do server-side rendering, and also an app shell so that you can have something, more than just a loading message. You can actually have a nice app shell with some, quick painting content that will show the user that your app is loading and give you a better initial performance.
And it's really, really cool. It's a very good example of pretty much how cool schematics can be. Because it is really simple. There are a couple good blog posts out there that you can look at now, but it is really easy to generate app shells for your apps now. It's just running a command, which is really good. It's really cool how much stuff is coming into the CLI.
Yeah, I mean, I just, before we leave, I want to do one thing and kind of paint a vision for the future, because one of the kind of most amazing things, one of the things I love the most about Angular is because we've taken this platform approach, because we're trying to kind of own all parts of the developer experience, we have a lot of kind of superpowers where you write your Angular code as you do today, as you did yesterday, as you're going to do tomorrow. And as it makes sense, we can kind of opt in for you or make it possible to very trivially opt into the web platform as it continues to evolve. So we've seen this today with kind of server-side rendering. We've seen this with Service Worker and progressive web apps, which are really great at engaging developers, building better user experiences. But I think towards tomorrow, in terms of the things that we could kind of automatically opt developers into. So one really exciting one is WebAssembly. If at some point in the future it makes sense to start shipping more WebAssembly to users because it's smaller, faster, whatever, we could opt developers into that automatically. So taking their existing code through the compilation process and ship only the appropriate WebAssembly. And the same thing happens with things like ES 2015 modules, which they're much smaller, they're much better developer experience. They're actually supported in most browsers. But if you do that, that breaks crawlability from some web crawler engines. And so kind of, I love this idea that we as a team are going to kind of keep watching the web and watch it and understand it as it continues to evolve and be part of that evolution, and then automatically give developers the tools to opt in or opt in for them as soon as those technologies are ready and as soon as those it makes sense to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've really come a full circle here with your opening line about how the real value proposition with Angular is that it's building for the modern web, and so I think this really nice handholding and smart defaults for your CLIs is very cool. And, it seems like you guys have a really good infrastructure architecture in plan for, making it easy for developers to migrate and use new features and, have progressive web apps and use service workers. So it's really great. I think I'm sold now that Angular is a platform. My only request now is can we break up the platform so other we can use it without being tied to Angular libraries, because there's so many cool tools I want to use, but I can't take advantage of them.
Schematics actually has its own command line tool. It doesn't
awesome.
require Angular.
Yes, great. Awesome. I will check out schematics.
Yeah, the whole dev kit piece is pulled out of the CLI so that other platforms can use that if they wanted to. There's other tools as well with Webpack and other things there that other groups and other frameworks could possibly use.
Yeah, and it seems like absolutely my next greenfield project, I will absolutely be giving Angular a look, because it seems like you guys have a pretty solid platform here. So congratulations to all of you and the open source community.
Thank you.
And yeah,
Awesome.
So Danny, want to wrap us up?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So, Michael and Stephen, thank you very much for coming on and talking with us. Again, as folks that listen to the show, I am a very big Angular fan, so I always like talking about this kind of stuff. I've been really happy with the direction Angular's been going, and from some of the rumblings and seeing what's coming in the future. So again, thank you both very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to come back next time we have something cool to show, or maybe a deep dive in some of these very, very complex, rich topics.
I could.
Sorry.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to, and I will absolutely hold you to it. All right. So thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Again, this was episode 149, almost 150. Still always surprised that number keeps going up. But episode 149, where we talked about Angular, Angular 5, and the future of Angular. Thank you all very much.